I'm here to tell you some stories this morning, but I promised Michael I wouldn't tell all of them because I don't want him to lose his job here at Pepperdine. But thanks for the invitation to speak to you guys today, both about my own personal history as a climber and an adventurer, as Michael said, but also as an employee of Patagonia and a card-carrying Patagoniac. So my own history with the company started with my friendship with Yvon Chouinard, who's the guy with the hammer, shown here when he was in his early 20s with his business partner, Tom Frost. And together, these guys were making the really first quality equipment for rock climbers in North America. And that included pitons like these that climbers back in the day drove into cracks to protect themselves if they fell. But by the early 70s, Yvon and other climbers, including me, we could see that these pitons were causing permanent damage in the rock, and every party that climbed a route, a popular route especially, would hammer these things in and then hammer them out, so that with each ascent, the holes in the cracks were getting bigger and bigger, like permanent damage to the cathedral of where we were come to worship our sport. So Yvon came up with a solution, a new way to protect yourself using what climbers called chalk stones, these metal wedges and angles that you see hanging off Yvon, and you could put them in the crack and they wouldn't cause any damage at all. And it revolutionized rock climbing. The sales of the company went up, even though the sales of pitons went down. And Yvon learned an enormously important lesson, that you could do better for the planet while you also did better for your business. But it wasn't just the business that provided the lessons that shaped who we are and what we did, but it was the adventures themselves. And for Yvon, the biggest one was in 1968 when he and his climbing partner, Doug Tompkins, who's the guy in the green shirt, and who himself had a small company in San Francisco that also made outdoor gear called the North Face, proposed that they load surfboards and climbing gears and skis into a used Ford van and drive 9,000 miles south to a place called Patagonia, where they would attempt a new route on the region's most emblematic peak, Fitzroy, the big peak there. So let's listen to Yvon tell us about the story.
Picked up a 16mm Bolex camera to record the trip. Loaded the car up with surfboards and climbing gear and took off for a 10,000-mile trip down south. I think from the time when we decided to go, it was like 2 weeks before we went. We bought this old van and took off from Ventura. 1968, you gotta remember the Pan American Highway was pretty wild. It was dirt road from Mexico City all the way south. It was like being in Montana or Wyoming 100 years ago. Here we're in an area that's the size of the whole American West, with no people.
For those of us that grew up going out into the wilds of the world, where nature was basically untouched, we got into our souls a sense of beauty.
That trip had a big influence on both Doug and I. It kind of set the course for what we were going to do later in life. For me, it was the best trip of my life.
So once they were back, Yvon expanded his business and started to sell a few items of clothing to climbers. And by 1973, he needed to spin that part of the business off. And now this was only like less than 5 years after that trip to Fitzroy and to Patagonia, the place. And that's where the inspiration came from. To call the clothing business Patagonia, and that's where the logo came from. The highest point in the skyline of the logo is Fitzroy, the peak they climbed on that 68 trip. Now this was about the time that I also started climbing with Yvon, at first helping him test gear and clothing, and we had some pretty pretty cool adventures ourselves, as you can tell by this photo, after a successful ascent in Alaska. Now, Yvonne was more of a rock climber, and I was drawn to the high altitude peaks in the world. And in 1976, I got a chance to be part of the American Bicentennial Everest expedition. Back then, this was only the second time that Americans had been to the world's highest mountain. And it was my first trip to the Himalayas. And I remember when I first got the phone call inviting me on the trip, I thought, well, you might as well start at the top and work down. But near our camp in what's called the South Col at 26,000 feet, I got what turned out to be pleurisy in my lungs. So I didn't get all the way to the very summit. And I left the mountain with doubts whether I had what it took to climb at extreme elevations. Well, I had a chance to find out 2 years later if I had it or not when I got another invitation to join another expedition, this time to K2. And as some of you know, that's now considered the hardest mountain in the world to climb. And all I can say is it's a good thing we didn't know that back then. The mountain had only been climbed twice before by Italians and Japanese, but never by the route that we proposed, a knife-edge ridge on the very border between Pakistan and China. And my climbing partner and I got to lead this section of the climb. And you can just see our previous Camp 3 position here. And close to where this photograph's taken, we knew we needed to position a new camp. But you can also see there's no natural place for a tent. So we had finally just to take out our ice axes and snow shovels and chop off the top of the ridge and set up our tent. So I went inside to start the stove, and through the tent wall I heard my climbing partner saying, "Hey, it's great out here." And I said through the tent wall, "What's great?" And he goes, "Well, I'm taking a piss into Pakistan and a shit into China without even moving." So we just had the tent set up, and the first storm hit. We had to stay in our hike camp, hoping that the weather was going to improve, but we were using food and fuel that we'd really worked hard to carry all the way up there. And after a full week, we had no choice but to abandon the camp and rappel back down to base camp. And my climbing partner had a sense of humor, so we're stuck in this tent for a week. And on about the 8th day, he says, "You know, Rick, I'm really sorry." And I said, "You know, sorry for what?" And he goes, "Well, I'm really sorry that I'm not a girl." And I said, "Well, you and I are together on that." So on about the 9th day, the storm cleared, and we worked really hard to get back to our high point, pulling out all those ropes from the new fallen snow and digging out the buried tents and repairing our camps. It took several more days. Finally, we were ready to cross the rest of that knife edge, and we regained our previous high point. We got the next camp set up, and we were just getting ready to push up to the next one when the next storm hit. And after another week, again, no choice but to go all the way down to our base camp and wait it out for a full week, then go all the way back up again, spending another week or two digging the ropes out, resurrecting the tents, repairing them. And again, getting ready to make the final push to the top when the next storm hits, and we go all the way back down again, and you get it, up and down, yo-yoing. And really struggling to safeguard what was left of our optimism and our commitment. And I remembered at this time another climbing partner who back then told me what's now that well-known saying that, you know, that's how you eat an elephant, just one bite at a time. And I had to continually remind myself of the wisdom of those words. So finally we got the high camp back in, and we had a little break in the weather, and there were only 4 of us left out of an initial team of 14 who had any juice left to try to make that last-ditch push to the top. And tempers were thin, the food supply was next to nothing, and the 4 of us started up to make an 11th hour attempt. And sure enough, looking up at that summit pyramid that you see right here, we couldn't agree which way to go. So, you know, being climbers, we compromised by dividing into two groups. Everybody just kind of going their own way. My partner and I tried to do a direct finish up this route here, and the other two guys, showing much more common sense than us, went around to the left, and here you see them on the last stage of the climb to the summit, approaching what's called the Narrows at 27,000 feet in good climbing conditions. And this was definitely the most technical part of the last part, push to the summit. My partner and I had to give up on our route because of avalanche conditions, and we went around and joined these and followed these guys up the next day. But we had to, my partner and I had to abandon everything at this point, leaving behind our oxygen and our ropes and all of our protection equipment, and we ended up climbing the full last section of the climb without any ropes or anything, completely unprotected. But we did that afternoon finally get to the top. So it was only the third ascent of the mountain, the first American ascent, and the first time anybody had done it without oxygen. But boy, was it ever painful and hard. We spent a few minutes on top and got back to our high camp to join our other two colleagues who were just as wiped out as we were. And you know, I always get this question, well, if it's that crazy and painful, like, why? Which is a reasonable question, but there's a myriad of answers, of course, and one of them is this moment when these two guys who are as hurting as we are force themselves to get up and turn on the stove and say, we'll make some cocoa for you guys. And I'll never forget that. I'll never forget when Jim then went to change the cartridges on the stove and blew up the whole tent, and it burned down, and I lost my hair and my mustache. You can see what's left of the tent in the red one there. After spending 4 guys spending the night in a tent that was made for 1.5 people. But we started down the next day, and descending was definitely the most dangerous part of this one. It took us 4 days. And finally, we got back to base camp. Nobody had died. We had a little bit of damage to ourselves from the last stage of the climb, but we had been climbing above 18,000 feet for 68 days in a row. And I had lost a little bit of weight. That's what I looked like. And I'd gotten a little frostbite heading for the summit. So I was hurting, but my other friend, Wickwire, in the blue jacket there, was really in bad shape. He had frostbitten lungs, and his diaphragm had collapsed, and he was on his way out, but we got him evacuated, and we all made it back. Again, after 5 days above 26,000 feet. I don't think anybody's ever done that before or since. It took 5 months altogether on that climb from when we got dropped off in the vehicle to when we got back to the roadhead. And like I said at the outset, I wasn't even sure we could pull this off. Midway through, I didn't think we could do it, but it was that eating an elephant lesson. Now, 2 years later, I ended up in China as they opened their doors to mountaineers, and I was invited to join a group going to Sichuan province in eastern Tibet, a region that no Westerner had been to in over 50 years, to attempt a 25,000-foot peak called Minyakonka that had only been climbed once before. And it was my kind of trip to a little-known area that really had a sense of exploration with a good team of close friends. On this time, a pretty easy one-week walk-in from the trailhead with horses and ponies to help us carry the gear, where we established a camp and started up the mountain in traditional climbing style, setting our camps one day apart. And it was fairly moderate climbing and in a really, really remote area, making it a fascinating enterprise until about the second week into the climb. Coming down from our second camp, this picture was the last one we took on this day, because a few minutes later, an avalanche broke out from under our feet and swept 4 of us down the mountain 1,500 vertical feet. And I thought I was dead for sure. I didn't think there was any way any of us were going to live through this, as we were sucked inside the avalanching snow. It probably took a full minute, but it seemed like a full eternity. October 13th, 1980, the date is seared in my mind, because that's the day I knew I was dead. And then the avalanche slowed and stopped, and I wasn't completely buried. I was able to dig myself out, and I was alive. I was even relatively uninjured. But my companions weren't quite as fortunate. Kim had his back broken in several places, and his knees were really blown out, and we had to carry him out like this for a week. Yvonne had a concussion and some broken ribs, and my very close friend and companion, Jonathan, who was my business partner, we were a writer-photographer team for National Geographic, was the most injured, and I kept him alive for a half hour, but then he died in my arms while I was holding him, and we buried him on the mountain with Buddhist prayer flags over his grave, and we went home, and I decided that was it, at least until I could decide whether the rewards outweighed the risks, because those risks were so palpably real. They had taken the life of one of my very best friends and had nearly taken my own, and I really had to assess what I was getting from this life of adventure. And I thought back to Everest, where I'd given everything I could and missed the top, and I remembered those doubts that I had carried home from the mountain, that I'd carried up to K2, and we had stuck it out for over 2 months above 18,000 feet, and what I'd learned about that, and what lessons I brought back home to sea level, and how I really had learned to attempt projects that, at the beginning seemed insurmountable. And as I said, I learned the way you do that is just one piece at a time. It was about commitment and tenacity, and it was also about doing your homework and your research, and knowing that even if you don't have all the answers at the outset, that you can figure it out as you go along. And I learned a lot about flexibility and how to adapt, and consequently, after 2 years of thinking like this, I realized that I wasn't the same person that I was when I set off down this path. And I also knew that the avalanche had somehow really shifted something very fundamentally inside of me, much more than I realized. The National Geographic wanted me to go back to Nepal to finish a story for them that Jonathan and I had halfway done. And I was in Kathmandu in the bar at the Yak and Yeti when I saw this very attractive woman sitting down at the other end, and she was by herself, so I bought her a drink, and we started to chat, and a little bit later she moved into the beach shack I had. I told her that I had this little beach shack just south of Montecito. The truth was it was just north of Oxnard, but the line worked, and we were married in '82, and we're still like totally happily married with 3 kids. But it wasn't a coincidence that I signed up for this shift in my life so soon after I'd nearly died. And I was also ready to go back to the mountains. And I had a chance to do that in 1983 when these 2 guys called me up. Frank Wells on the left was at that time, president of Warner Brothers. He worked his way up the ladder. Dick Bass was an oil and gas guy from Texas. And they had this loony idea that without even knowing how to climb, they might be able to climb the highest mountain on each of the 7 continents. Dick also had a ski resort called Snowbird, which he still owns. So they called this loony effort 7 Summits, and they asked me to join them on any of the climbs that I might want to come along, and I did. I went with these guys to Antarctica, to Everest, to South America, and we got all the climbs except for Everest. But Dick went back 2 more times, and on the 3rd attempt, at age 55, at that time the oldest guy to ever climb Everest, he made it. He's the first guy to climb the 7 summits, and I remember getting a phone call from him from base camp on his satellite phone right after he got down, and he said, Rick, it just goes to prove that the second half, by that he meant life after 50, can be and should be the best half. So I had some pretty cool mentors. And I was back in the game. And this time I really did focus on exploration. I made the first full crossing of Borneo from one side to the other, right through the middle of the island, 800 miles through remote jungles. On another jungle adventure, we climbed a super remote peak in the middle of the Amazon that nobody had ever been up before, that was 80 miles from the last village, and that village was pretty Stone Age. And from the top, you could look out over the jungle and know that what you were seeing was what the Earth looked like before people had even evolved on our planet. Now, about the same time as this trip, I did another expedition to Africa where we climbed up a remote side of Kilimanjaro. And then from the summit is where the trip really started, because from there we walked due east 500 kilometers all the way to the Indian Ocean across these remote bushlands that put you in the close company of critters that also put you several runs down the food chain. And some of you, I think, may have received the book I wrote on this trip called The Shadow of Kilimanjaro. And also, if you don't know it, this was a trip that Michael joined me on and actually walked with us for a couple of weeks through these bushlands. So I was learning a lot of important lessons, including a deep appreciation for wild places, but increasingly firsthand, I was also starting to see these places I loved diminish. In South America, Yvonne and I went back to Patagonia once, and we hiked across those grasslands where in 1968 he and Doug Tompkins had encountered only undeveloped wild grasslands, and now we could see these survey stakes laid out for what became the city of Chaltén. And I'm sometimes asked what my favorite climb is in the world, and that's a tough call, but way, way up on the list was the ice window route on Mount Kenya, where the approach is towards this vertical ice, but instead of climbing up it, you actually go inside the mountain through an ice cave, where you go up the cave and then chop out a hole through the top, and there you are on the summit of the peak that you see here when I took this shot on that climb. And I'm putting it up now because all that snow's gone. The glacier is gone. The ice window route is gone. It's not going, it's gone. So you see what I'm talking about. Now, my own personal involvement in Patagonia also started during this same time that I was doing all this exploration and climbing. And I'll shift here a little bit to tell you about that stage of my life when, as a contract photographer and a marketer, I began to work with Patagonia, that was located in Ventura because it was 2 blocks from a good surf break. That's why the company's there. And it was also 4 blocks from the mouth of the Ventura River, where in the early 70s, where in the early 70s, the city council had decided that they were going to develop a resort right next to where Yvonne had located the company. And that is another one of the seminal moments and experiences in the company's history. So let's listen to Yvonne tell us about that.
In the 70s, the city wanted to channelize the Ventura River, and there was a city council meeting, and so we decided to all go because we were concerned that it was going to hurt the sand flow. And so we showed up, and there was all these scientists there saying, it's not going to hurt the river because it's a dead river, so just forget about it. And at the end of the talk, a young grad student got up and showed a slideshow of all the life along the river, all the eels and the birds that nest along the river, and the raccoons. There was still 50 steelhead that go up that polluted river, and it wasn't dead at all. And that brought the house down, and it showed me what one individual can do, the power of one individual. That led to us starting a Friends of the Ventura River, and now we're working on trying to take out a dam upstream that is preventing the steelhead from going up into one of the tributaries. I really like the idea of taking out no longer useful dams When you take out a dam, that's a real victory. I mean, a concrete victory, so to speak. It's gone. And then that allows fish to migrate up. It stops the water from heating up. People built those dams, and people have the responsibility to take them down. I think all of us are responsible for doing something. I mean, if you can, you're a good speaker, you should get out and speak about the injustices of the world. You know, if you're a good writer, write about it. If you have nothing but free time, you should volunteer for good causes. To do good, you actually have to do something.
Well, so what we decided to do with our business is use it as a tool for environmental change. So my position at Patagonia is now the VP of Environmental Affairs, and the team I work with oversees two parts of that mission statement you see there. And it starts with our commitment to make our product causing no unnecessary harm in our supply chain and our operations. And notice that it doesn't say cause the least harm. And rather it says no unnecessary harm, because the flip side of that is that all manufacturing is harmful. And we need to own up to that. So that means you have to strive to keep doing better, because you know you can never get there. Because even if you know there's no such thing as true sustainability, that you still have to keep lowering your footprint on a continual basis. So how do we do that? Well, we've got a number of programs and initiatives, including one that we launched 2 years ago. That's a partnership with our customers to take mutual responsibility for the entire life cycle of the stuff that we make and that they buy, that you guys buy, or at least those of you in the room that have healthy allowances from your parents. But we decided to structure this partnership around the 4 R's because everyone's already familiar with them. And so under each R, we've defined what your responsibility is and what we think our responsibility is. And the most controversial ones of this for us was the reduce part. Now, could we really get the moxie to tell our customers to only buy our stuff if they really needed it? And it took about 3 years of internal coaxing before Yvonne and I finally got everybody, including the salespeople, lined up behind the idea of running an ad that some of you I know about, that came out 2 years ago on Black Friday. The 2-year anniversary is just around the corner now. You know, I'm sure most of you know that Black Friday is so named because that's the day when brands and retailers go from red ink to black. So we launched this ad in the New York Times that was right after the 5-page spread of Macy's, launching Macy's Christmas ad, except we asked our customers not to buy our best-selling jacket unless they really did need it. And then the copy goes on to explain that, you know, I know what most of you guys already know, that the planet's going from 7 to 9 billion. Affluence is growing at 2.5% per annum compounded. The current overuse of the planet's resources is about 150% beyond capacity. Project that out in a few years, it's 500%. And, you know, no criticism intended, but you don't need an MBA to know that that means bankruptcy. So we also knew that an ad like this would try to appeal to people's intellects, but we also needed to appeal to their hearts. And we're pretty good at that. We always have done our own marketing. So here's a little video that we developed that came out right after this ad that was a little less cerebral, but it really did speak to the emotion of the issue.
Though we now use the resources of 1.5 planets, we have only one to call home. We are exhausting the Earth, and the time has come to live within our means. To reimagine a world in which we take nothing from nature that we cannot replace. This is something we can do. This is something we are called to do. And if we are quiet, we will surely hear it. To do more with less, make fewer things. Pursue not what we vaguely want, but what we deeply need. This we have the power to do together, to act on behalf of the natural world that sustains us. Living is not fine. To be a citizen of the earth is to put one's brief life to the use of one's dearest gifts, to summon the better angels of our nature, to own up to all the harm that we do, and then do all in our power to put an end to it. Our way of doing business has outgrown our planet, and now merely runs on reserves. A new economy must rise in its place that better meets our fundamental purpose, provides balance, and gives nature a chance to rest and time to heal. Join us. We will be citizens and ambassadors, each with a destiny of our own, but with a common pledge to honor life and nature.
So the last part of that mission statement is to use our business to inspire solutions to the environmental crisis, and that's often by trying to convince other businesses to follow our lead. And one of our biggest successes in that area is an invitation to other apparel and footwear companies to create what's called the Sustainable Apparel Coalition that we started in 2009 with this unlikely partner. And Patagonia, when we invited Walmart to partner with us to in turn invite a select group of companies into a coalition with the goal of developing a tool to measure sustainability that would become potentially uniform across the apparel and footwear sectors. So I met with several high-level executives from Walmart and told them about it, and they agreed to look into it. I told them we wanted to codename the effort David and Goliath, and they said, yeah, that's cool, but we got one problem with that. And I went, oh God, here it comes. And they said, we're okay with this as long as we're David and you're Goliath. So I said, whatever. So we started this in 2009 with this letter on the masthead with the two logos of the two companies side by side. It went out to a dozen other companies, inviting them to attend a meeting where, and I'll read from the letter, we expect to achieve consensus on the need for a universally accepted approach for measuring apparel sector sustainability, and to establish a strategy for ongoing collaboration to create and implement a standard. So one CEO told me later, from a really big company, he says, you know, when you get a letter with the logos of Patagonia and Walmart right next to each other, it's so bizarre that you got to read it, which was our idea. So everybody signed up, and now 2.5 years later, we have 130 companies in the coalition representing 40% of the market share for apparel and footwear on planet Earth. And it's a multi-stakeholder coalition. We have a lot of suppliers. Our holding companies like Kering and VF Corporation, and they have multiple apparel and footwear brands in their portfolios, so that in total we now have about 250 brands in this coalition. And we are all working together to develop these uniform tools, which are now in their second iteration that will be actually released next week, and it's called the Higg Index. And that's the main product that this group has created. And the Higg is designed to measure the impacts broadly and deeply through the entire supply chain and even the value chain, from the full life cycle of products, cradle to grave. beginning with the impact of raw materials that are used to make the products, including those materials' impacts on natural resources, and then the impacts of fabrication and manufacturing, the impacts from packaging, the impacts from shipping. And they also take into the account of how consumers use the products and how they or the company dispose of them when they're at the end of their life. So the results of these measurements are now being aggregated into benchmarks against which all the coalition members can measure their own organization's performance against their peers. And this in turn has created a really fascinating dynamic where it's unleashed everybody's competitive juices so that we now have really accurately a race to the top to reduce both environmental and social labor impacts of making stuff. And we're pretty proud to have kickstarted this effort since it's aligned with what you saw earlier in our mission statement, that last part of it, to implement solutions to the environmental crisis. Now, this challenge to ourselves includes efforts to, in addition to sustainability efforts, programs to protect what's left of the wild part of our environment, the natural world that led Yvonne and others of us in the company to be climbers and surfers and skiers, to now work together to collectively safeguard the places that have given that direction and inspiration to our lives that you've seen a little bit of today. And we do that primarily through our grant program called 1% for the Planet. And we tithe every year, right off the top of our revenue, 1% back to the earth. Not profits, but revenue. Rain or shine, good year, bad, that 1% goes into the pot. And we're currently at about $650 million. So this year, that means that my group will be giving out $6.5 million to about 750 NGOs. And most of them are struggling to save their backyard rivers and forests and beaches and wetlands. Wild habitat and wildlife protection has been near and dear to our hearts, and it's all rooted, as I told you earlier, in our passions for climbing and surfing and protection of what's left of our fragile planet. So that's a brief overview of the company, a brief overview of my own experiences that have shaped who I am, that I brought down from those high mountains and applied to my life back at sea level. But before I wrap it up right now, I got one more experience to share with you. And it started 13 years ago in 2000 when this young woman came to Patagonia for an internship. She stayed for the summer, and I already knew her pretty well because she was 13 months old when her father had died in my arms on that remote mountain in Tibet while I was trying to keep Jonathan alive. And he had named his only daughter Asia after the land that he loved above everything. And she was now 20 years old, and I knew that at the end of this internship, she would very likely want to learn a little bit more about her father and even how her father had died. And I was anticipating that, and it happened. The week before she was to go back, she asked if she could talk to me, and we sat on our porch, and I told her the full story. And it was harsh. You know, he was hurt badly, and he didn't die right away, but I didn't hold anything back. And then she asked me something that I wasn't ready for at all. I had not anticipated this. And she said that the real reason she'd come out that summer was because she wanted me to take her to Tibet and climb the mountain and find her father's grave. So we did that. And I knew it was going to be a lot more than just that, because she wanted to find her father, the guy that she didn't know at all, and she wanted me to teach him who he was, and she really needed a father. So So I tried to do that. We brought his journals, and we read those in the tent at night, and I told her the stories that I've told you today. And it was a tough trip. The weather was really bad. The mission was frightening for both of us, and I wasn't even sure I could find the grave 20 years later. And if I could, what condition would it be in? But finally, at over 19,000 feet, we found this stone grave where we had buried him so many years before, and it was in complete disrepair. So Asia and I literally gathered up in our hands her father's bones, and we rebuilt the grave, and we placed a plaque on it and erected new prayer flags and left him there. So I had told her, as I said, many of the stories I've shared with you, the stories about her father, his life as an adventure, the lessons that I'd learned, and the lessons that I knew she would have learned from him had he lived. And I told her about tenacity, about commitment, about boldness. And I explained how you go about eating that elephant as a strategy. And I explained how my time in the wild places of our world had given me these lessons that I brought down and applied to my life at sea level, including my business life. And that's the one that I want to leave you with here today. And it is the awareness that all of you in the room here have that power in you to make the change that we all need. You know, I learned that in the high mountains. We all learn it in different places, and we all own it. And you guys in particular own it. Because at this stage in your life, I think the most powerful tool in your hand is the choice that you're going to make as you go out into the business world and decide who you're going to work for. And you have the ability to do your homework, and I know you know how to do that because you've been here at this school. You can do your due diligence on anybody that you're considering you might want to work for. And if they don't own up to your standard, if they're not truly committed to giving back to our world more than they're taking from it, then you guys got to tell them that you're sorry. That's just not the kind of place where you're going to spend your time. Because if you do that, the companies, and along with the companies, all of business on our planet, and the entire global economy is going to have to follow your lead. Thank you.